Welcome to ESRA's first Digital 2020 Education Series webinar. And now, turning it over to Steve Bisbee, President and founder of eOriginal.
Thank you, Mallory. As she mentioned, I'm Steve Bisbee, President and founder of eOriginal. We are a leading provider of digital transaction management solutions, primarily for financial services. I was the co-inventor of the eOriginal technologies and oversaw the creation and delivery of unique digital solutions that replace paper processes in order to expedite transactions and create efficiencies in business. We support over 600 clients in an extensive industry digital ecosystem. The Electronic Signatures and Records Association was formed in 2004 to educate and advocate for the use and acceptance of electronic signatures and records. I've been on the board of ESRA since its inception. I'm here today with my good friend and colleague, Margot Tank, who is a partner at DLA Piper LLP and is the U.S. co-chair of the firm's financial services sector. She's been helping companies with digital transformation for over 20 years and has advised on over 1,000 processes and platforms that enable digital transactions and digital payments, including the financial services, commercial retail commerce, and the healthcare space. Margot is counsel to ESRA and an ex officio board member as well. Margot and I are the co-chairs of ESRA's Digital 2020 Education Series. Margot?
Thank you, Steve. Our members are dedicated to providing, promoting, and participating in ESRA values: expertise, leadership, collaboration, accessibility, and technology neutrality. As part of ESRA's mission to educate on electronic signatures, we put together this education series that will run from July through December. The education series will provide insight and practical guidance on business, technology, and legal implementation issues across a wide spectrum of applications. There will be presentations from ESRA members and their partners on topics ranging from remote online notarization to digital mortgage and auto finance, to the use of voice signatures and other biometric methods to authenticate signers and execute documents, and many of the legal issues associated with the same. Notwithstanding the ESIGN was enacted 20 years ago, there's still a learning curve as companies continue to transform their business practices. These issues are of even more critical importance during this time of social distancing, remote work, and contactless consumer and business-to-business engagement. We hope that you'll find these webinars useful.
Thank you, Margot. And so finally, we'd like to introduce our speaker today, Ken Moyle, who's the leader of K6 Partners. K6 has a global network of experts and offers customized, focused consulting and legal services to help businesses of all sizes adapt to the technological advancements that are changing the competitive landscape. Ken was Chief Counsel and Vice President of Legal and Corporate Affairs at DocuSign. Ken is a leading authority on the practical, legal, and policy issues that accompany digital transformation and is a well-known subject matter expert, speaker, and author. Ken is the chair of ESRA's Public Policy Committee. In addition to discussing technology and public policy, winning over skeptics in power, he will speak to some of ESRA's public policy initiatives as well. To find out more about ESRA, you can go to www.esignrecords.org. And to the extent you have any questions about the education series or ESRA, please feel free to reach out to either Margot or myself, and we will provide the information at the end of Ken's presentation. Ken, over to you.
Thank you, Steve. Appreciate it. Thank you very much for the introduction, and welcome everybody. We're going to talk about public policy and technology today, and it's a very actually timely subject. Obviously, we have some things going on right now in Washington, D.C. that affect technology and public policy and represent a flashpoint in that natural tension. So let's talk about what we're going to really address today. We're going to talk about first government and technology and sort of the natural tensions between the two as they're playing out today. I want to go over a framework that we at K6 Partners have taken to heart. It's the 6 laws of technology. That's where the 6 in K6 comes from. And then move to how we at ESRA and how we at K6 have viewed lawmakers' approach to technological change and some of the the methods that that we have used to help advocate for greater adoption and embracing of digital transactions generally and technology. And then we have a list of do's and don'ts, as well as a kind of a summary of what we're doing at ESRA and how you can help. So as I mentioned, going on right now this week is some familiar faces via webcam on Capitol Hill today. These faces have been in the news, so-called big tech, and their chieftains have been under a lot of scrutiny lately due to well, first of all, for their personal wealth that has arisen from creating innovative technologies and new ways of doing things. These are known in Silicon Valley as disruptions, disrupting current business models, disrupting supply chains and everything else that we consider to be normal everyday things. These are embraced and adored here on the West Coast, and sometimes regulators actually have a different view of them, and certain stakeholders obviously are has some fear about how those things work. And of course, as we'll talk about later, technology seems to be always outrunning attempts to regulate it, and that results in some gaps in oversight that sometimes the folks with the best of intentions do not recognize. So I think one way to look at any approach to technology, innovation, adoption, and policymaking is sort of the natural tension between what we would call regulation and innovation. Again, this is sort of the U.S. Chamber's view of things, but it's basically there is a tension naturally between government regulators and technology companies, and we should recognize that most of this has to do with biased information, bad information, and lack of mutual respect and understanding for the role that each of these parties plays. And there is a role to play for government as well as innovative technologies. So to put it another way, there's a means by which technology that advances can recognize where it is in history with respect to the governing principles of regulation. And if you recognize where you are in that continuum, you have a better idea, a better concept for seeking out and obtaining the outcomes that are mutually beneficial for everybody, all stakeholders. Want to get to the Cransbergs Laws, which I call them, which are Melvin Cransberg of the Georgia Institute of Technology developed a list of what he would call truisms that really have more of a cultural and political ring to them that will help inform any attempt to move technological advancements through the regulatory process. So let's go through those real quickly. I think they're very interesting. First one of Melvin Cransberg's laws is that technology is neither good nor bad. I think we've heard that many times before, where the technology is simply a tool, and the tool can be used for good or ill, but the tool itself is not, doesn't take on any of those values. That's true, and it's not true. There's a neutrality that technology purists will take on and say that, hey, this is just a tool, you can use it as you will. We should just go ahead and release it into the wild and let people figure out whether to use it for good or bad. That's probably not a responsible thing to do, and it doesn't recognize the fact that there are some value-laden decisions that need to be made when releasing technology. Some more recent examples include social media. You know, one of the reasons that other than the wealth disparity in the creators of social media practices that have arisen is sort of a cultural phenomenon that a lot of people view as negative, and whether that be the nature and current discourse environment, politically and otherwise, to cancel culture, to public shaming and things like that. The social media has been blamed for that, and it is a means by which that occurs, and it's hard to extract an objective view of the technology from that mix. Mobile devices themselves, mobile devices have changed the way that society works, both for good and for ill. Even in the area of the technology used for fracking, that has been a boon to some industries and a curse to some other stakeholders. AI, artificial intelligence, you've heard much about this, and the looming dangers of artificial intelligence, not only in the terms of eliminating jobs and being disruptive in that way, but also in you know, in greater sort of existential fears about what happens when our robot overlords take over. You'll hear a lot on artificial intelligence either way, and those are non-neutral factors, and they are indeed related to technology and the values that are associated with implementing it. This is an interesting one, and those of you folks who are early adopters probably will understand this, and those of you who consider yourselves laggards probably think it's crazy. But you'll see in the early stages of a technology adoption that there are folks that are religious about using technology for technology's sake, and they will be the ones that will crack the code in terms of going through the pain of early adoption and forcing use of technology for being more efficient, and they lose all their efficiency in trying to get it to work, but they still believe in it. These folks are definitely a different breed from those who are skeptical of technology and say, why do I need that? Why do I need that if you know, if I've already got the way we do things, it's just fine. So we have that natural, again, that natural tension, and those folks who are married to the concept of using technology for technology's sake will be the ones that find a use for a technology that may be imperfect at the time. For example, you may find folks who were early adopters of cellular phones. In fact, there used to be those of us who are of a certain age remember when texting involved using a 9-button phone that you had to actually punch and hold your numeric key in order to get the right letter. It was very tedious, but folks pushed it until we ended up with our current cell phone keypads that we have today. This might seem a little obscure, but it's important to understand that technology is actually aggregated, and it comes in packages, whether those be big packages or small packages. And in the context of public policy and winning over hearts and minds, there has to be an appreciation for the fact that a single technology usually isn't worth fighting for. It is the technological environment that it creates and the future prospects for it that need to be kept in mind when creating law and policy. The concept of the Apple App Store, for example, really made the iPhone take off. And for a lot of people, the iPhone was considered to be the first cell phone, even though it wasn't. It wasn't even the first smartphone. But because of the app and ecosystem that it created, it became something much larger than just simply a phone that you carried with you. The consumer applications, the platform ecosystems such as eBay, Amazon, DocuSign. These are things that that actually create an ongoing demand for the product and tend to move technology forward as a result of that participation. I think this one probably, we're going to come back to this one, but this is key, I think, to any public policy approach, and that is that there are technology bills, there's technology legislation, there's technology rulemaking, but you will find that although technology is the nominal characteristic of the enactment, that policy is really driven by non-technical factors. These are the soft factors, they're also the hard factors. But if you look at we'll just look at the current COVID-19 mitigation measures, you have that tension between what the scientists say we should do versus what the economy demands and the practicalities demand. The concept of national ID. We certainly have the tools to issue everybody a national ID, but that is something that most people think is never going to happen because of our cultural resistance to it. Cryptocurrency, again, these are issues that there's certainly a way to create a national cryptocurrency or a global cryptocurrency, but the disruption that causes to the current regulatory regime, to sovereignty, to privacy, things like that, those are things that definitely take precedence that will keep technology from being adopted as soon as it could be. This is a little bit more esoteric, but if you look at technology as both a driver and an indicator of human history, there's really nothing more relevant than technology. And this is something to keep in the back of the mind and to be able to learn from, because the issues that we are dealing with today with what we believe is rapid advancements of technology and a government that can't keep up with it, these are not new issues. These are issues that basically have driven every era of human existence, and the adoption or failure to adopt technology has always driven us from one era to another in history. And again, just coming back to the fact that technology itself is just a bunch of bits and bytes. Typically, it is not something that has much relevance until the human element is introduced. And the same thing with the history of technology. So this is kind of a wrap up. So it's pretty interesting that Cransberg presented these laws of technology. I wonder if we had an open forum here, if we could guess when, when in the internet world, at what point did Cransberg presented this law of technology. You might be surprised to know that it was 1985, which means this predated the internet, predated Facebook, Google, eBay, Microsoft, and all the other folks that we consider to be big tech today. So these observations were made prior to what we consider to be our new era of big tech. This is what technology looked like in 1985. Notice there's no modem there because there's no internet to speak of to use. So again, this is sort of I tell this to you only because what we're dealing with is not new. It is a human condition. It is something to learn from and to be very cognizant of as we move through history. So when we're talking to policymakers, let's walk a mile in their shoes and figure out what they are going through. I mean, you have different policymakers. You have private policymakers, of course. We're not really talking about that today. But we do have public policymakers, and those policymakers include lawmakers who are elected officials in legislatures and in Congress. We also have, and by the way, the president as well, we also have departments, bureaucrats, and part of the executive branch who implements these, whether they be secretaries of state, whether they be government regulators at the federal level, state level. But there is sort of a few things that run through their veins, regardless of who they are, and that is there is a definite resistance to change, and there's a good reason for that. First of all, when you're introducing something disruptive, the both regulators and the lawmakers are going to hear about it from those who are most threatened, and their voices will be the loudest. Think about how often you hear the subject of jobs coming up when whenever a new technology is introduced. Well, it's going to cost us jobs. Well, what's going to happen to my job? You know, when in the early days of ESRA, we had a pretty open and seemingly unassailable value proposition, which was to advance the use of electronic technologies, electronic signatures and records. And we were countered by groups, including the paper industry, who said they were threatened, felt they were threatened by the use of electronic documents. Also, there's an incrementalism that is involved in whenever there's rulemaking or lawmaking. You never find a situation where you're going to take a established law, rip it out, and completely replace it. It's very unusual. Typically, you amend or you tweak the current legislation or rule to accommodate a new technology. And this often results in a big sort of roll of a ball of string of attachments. I mean, look at the tax code, for example. The tax code is several thousand pages long, and it's really just a bunch of amendments to older rules. The problem you have with technology legislation is that typically the old rule was driven by what was technologically possible at the time that rule was written, with presumptions about how things would be conducted. And so when you go into the old rules, you will find things in there that don't quite make sense anymore. Some people have noticed that, for example, if you go into a brand new airplane, you'll go into the lavatory and find an ashtray in there. The rules against smoking on airplanes have been in place since the 70s, yet the FAA still has a rule about having a place to put a lit cigarette when you're in a lavatory. That has not been extracted, and there are people that will defend that to the death, that say that our compliance culture says that we should have that in there in case someone breaks the rules and needs to smoke. Also, these policies are backward looking. We'll talk about that in a little bit. There's also a presumption that the status quo is safer than introducing a change, mostly because folks figure that there's a reason for the rule to be in that place in the first place, and they don't want to find out when it's too late that they broke something. And that's a very legitimate concern, and it's something you as an advocate need to be very aware of and have to do your research. Example of some legacy rules that we just talked about, for example, this is an example. Here is the battle dress uniform of the United States Army in 1971. Who remembers what was going on in 1971? That was the Vietnam era. Please tell me how useful this uniform is in the jungle. It wasn't until 1981, well after the Vietnam War had ended, that they issued the new BDUs. This is the uniform that I wore when I was in the military, and we were being trained for what? We were being trained for the Vietnam War. All the mistakes and lessons that we learned in Vietnam were now finally making their way to the United States Army 10 years later. So this is something to keep in mind when you have you're dealing with rules, regulations that are in place, especially at the federal level. They are very slow to implement, and they tend to be backward looking. So how do we, given all this, how do we effectively achieve our desired outcomes? Well, one of the ways the ESRA approaches the issue is to really nail down what your outcome is and who your audience is. That's the first thing. Actually, the first thing is prioritizing an issue. You have limited resources, and you need to decide which issue is your big win that you're looking for, and what are the incremental wins that you can get along the way, including recognizing current threats that set you back versus moving you forward. So ESRA uses this framework. We first decide, okay, what is our outcome? Do we want to create a general awareness? Do we want a particular action to be taken? Do we want to basically sit in the background and create the political will to have something happen? And in developing that, we also need to identify what our audience is. The audience may be a general public, and the general public usually is subject to an awareness type of campaign, but sometimes it's we want the general public to take action. They may be influencers, folks who actually influence the decision makers or go right to the decision makers, which, looking at the upper right-hand corner of this matrix, you can see that is where you think you might want to go almost always, but it isn't always the case. Sometimes you have to create some rolling thunder and create the political will before change will take place. Again, in the upper right-hand corner, that is suing somebody, creating legislation, getting a bill passed, getting a regulation promulgated, things like that. So you need to identify this first before, so that you can create a narrative to influence or educate your audience. In so doing, we have a list of do's and don'ts that are, I think, probably pretty helpful for you. Again, clearly identifying your audience and your outcomes is a must. You have to do that. Then you have to prioritize multiple outcomes and be flexible to trade some away. Nobody gets 100% win. This is true in legislation. This is true in rulemaking. There are constituencies on all sides and stakeholders that you've never dreamed of who are all going to be pushing and pulling. And regardless of what the optimal outcome is in the view of the regulator, they have to give some or lawmaker, they have to give a win to most of their constituencies that they care about. ESRA definitely offers to educate and explain based upon its level of expertise. Our members and our council have basically the market cornered on expertise in electronic signatures and records and digital transactions. So that's generally the strength of using an organization versus a company to do your advocacy. And offering to educate and explain and clarify is really all that regulators and lawmakers really are looking for from stakeholder input. Understanding the other side, who's against you and why. Be able to research that and answer those objections. There and also be prepared to compromise with them, because you're never going to win the argument 100% and carry the day. There's going to be a compromise of some kind, and you have to understand what the objections are, and be able to handle those objections and address them in a rational and compelling way. Always follow up. Always stay connected, and be eager to help, and be polite. And WOGs, walk in the other guy's shoes. Make sure you understand when you have an audience what they're going through, what are their pains that we're trying to address, what are the gains they're trying to establish for themselves. Understand those. It's not just the validity or the efficacy of your issue that's at stake. It's also the career, popularity, or another intrinsic factors of your audience that you need to appeal to. The list of don'ts is probably pretty self-explanatory, but there's a tendency, and you've probably seen it with some of big tech in the past 10 years or even 2 years, general disrespect of the role of government. That tends to create introduce personality and vindictiveness into the process. You don't want to create that type of environment. You need to be open, and you need to actually completely be respectful of what the government agency or lawmakers are trying to do, address that, and move on. Antagonizing or insulting your audience when they don't see your point, or they seem like they're not understanding where you're coming from, the last thing you want to do is, again, get on their bad side by virtue of being arrogant or otherwise being dismissive. Another thing you don't want to do is emphasize commercial interest. Again, we've talked about, well, this will cost many jobs, but it's not, this will cost many jobs for my company. It's society at large will benefit by X. Society at large will be harmed because of Y. These are the things you need to be focused on. People are very wary of folks that have a obvious commercial interest coming in to a discussion or an advocacy session. Again, this is why it's very good to have an organization, a nonprofit, to be advocating on your behalf, rather than going in on your own with your corporate might and throwing your weight around. That doesn't play very well, certainly in Congress and elsewhere. ESRA has had an opportunity over the years to have quite a few wins that we've gone through. We've obviously started with the Federal ESIGN Act. That was ESRA's predecessor, lobbying for that, and there are folks on this call, Margot and Steve among them, who were very influential in getting the ESIGN Act and its predecessors passed in Congress. That was 20 years ago. ESRA has also been behind adoption of UEDA in additional states since when UEDA is the state version of ESIGN that was a predecessor of it. We've successfully advocated for regulation changes at both the IRS, Small Business Administration, the Housing and Urban Development Department, as well as some as well as Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, and things like that. We've more recently been behind the enactment of remote online notary statutes in several states, and that 14 number may be wrong because I think it's actually growing. Same thing with electronic wills. There have been several attempts to take a very good law that we lobbied for, which was technology neutral, and defeat technology specific amendments, specifically blockchain oriented sort of window dressing amendments to state laws, as well as federal laws. and sometimes defeating a dangerous or damaging type of bill is just as important as advancing a positive one. There's been some state regulations that have had outdated technical specs in them, including a lot of legacy electronic signature laws that included digital signature language that was actually implanted in the late 90s. And we've been able to erase that. And we've also been able to remove some exceptions to the use of electronic signatures in California. Many others. Currently, we are working under a set of policy principles. Our current initiatives include digital identity, remote online notary, as we talked about, e-titling of motor vehicles, that interoperability between states, electronic wills and trusts. One that's come up recently is voter registration, petitions, and initiatives, and furthering the adoption of the Uniform Electronic Transactions Act. And most recently, we are advocating for a slight change to the ESIGN Act to help further electronic commerce for consumers. I want to be able to introduce and mention our public policy principles. These are what drives ESRA's public policy efforts. We've taken a very hard look at what it means to comport with ESRA principles and it's ESRA's mission of driving adoption of electronic signatures and records. Interoperability is the first one, and that is that basically means that we want to make sure that there's sort of a uniformity, if you will, between statutes in various states or a federal type of oversight, so that there isn't friction between state governments in recognizing each other's products or in having one state essentially be an outlier and kind of get in the way of interstate commerce. Technology neutrality. Technology neutrality is crucially important. You've heard me mention the ESIGN Act, which is the 2000 law that enabled electronic signatures. The beauty of that act and why it's still relevant today is that it did not presume to have already have prescient knowledge of all of the technologies that could come into play. It simply said that there's a broad definition of what an electronic signature is, and plenty of allowance for technologies to be developed in the future, including blockchain, to be considered electronic and to be part of the coverage of that statute. Non-discrimination, again, discrimination between different technologies. So basically and non-discrimination between paper and pen versus electronic. That's why we like the overlay statute component of ESIGN. Overlay means we basically, rather than going in and rewriting a bunch of laws and giving certain weight and validity to electronic agreements versus paper agreements, we just said, look, an electronic record, an electronic signature, those are the same thing as a paper signature, and let the exceptions fly, but that's what an overlay statute will do. We also are cognizant of consumers, and we need to enable them to and empower them to do business electronically and to enjoy the benefits of technology without endangering their rights and their consumer protected status. We want to remove barriers, of course. We want to remove barriers to adoption electronic adoption of electronic signatures. And finally, innovation. We want to encourage innovation and make sure that we have the ability to further build upon whatever electronic or and digital environment that has been already established. Those are our principles.
Please visit our website and check out the rest of the lineup of webinars that we have coming up.
Great. Thanks, Mallory. Thank you, Ken. That was great, really. Hearts, minds, time passing, unintended consequences, or unanticipated events. Still, right, exactly. Unanticipated events, COVID-19 will still and always impact technology adoption. It's really, really interesting. But we sure have come a long way. Joining ESRA is a way to be part of the dialogue of change. We have a lot more great content, as was just mentioned, over the next few months. Please go to esignrecords.org and you can find out more about the education series. You can find out more about ESRA public policy initiatives and some of the things that Ken was talking about in terms of our values and the initiatives that are underway, and membership details. So thank you all very much for listening today.
Ken, thank you very much, as always.
Thank you. And you can contact me at info@k6partners.com.